Hey everybody, and welcome to this episode of Gaming Banter with David and Ryan. Today we have David
What? Hello.
and Derek, who's mute.
Are you doing it cool
He's,
guy
he's
style?
yeah, he doesn't talk. And Chris.
Hi guys, great to be here.
So David, why don't you take it away?
All right, so today we're talking about what makes a great 20-hour game into a mediocre 40-hour game, which I feel like I've experienced a lot. And I guess I get where from maybe a developer or even just from a sales standpoint, sometimes you do play a game and you thought, that's awesome, I wish there had been more of it. I kind of feel a little ripped off. Like, I loved it so much, I played it just from the minute I put it in to the end, and I just kind of crushed through in 2 days, playing 10 hours a day because we can. And so you're kind of, you kind of feel a little ripped off, like maybe you paid $49, $69, whatever you paid for the game for 20 hours entertainment, which is still better than the average movie ticket price. So like Shadow of the Colossus is a good example of a game that I liked a lot and would have even liked a little bit more of it. But it's not a super, super long game. It's kind of really to-the-point game. They could have made it a 40-hour game by adding little minions between bosses. So instead of fighting bosses, like Shadow of the Colossus, if you've never played, it's just bosses. You just go from boss to boss, and there's a real beautiful world you go through to get there, but it's not an overly sized world. And they could have put minions. Every time you go from one boss to another boss, you have to fight 60 different tiny guys who are just hack and slashing. The game could have been an extra 20 hours, but I think that would have made the game considerably less good. And I think that's what a lot of games do is they just add filler content to kind of give you something to do, so you sit down and play the game and you feel like you got a good $60 worth of experience out of it.
Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy.
Yeah. Like I feel like an infinite number of examples of just games with a lot of filler stuff where you're like, I'm just hacking and slashing these 3 types of little baddies over and over again, and I'm not even paying attention anymore, So that's the topic. What's your views on it, Chris?
So yeah, I was trying to think of how to break up this question a little bit more. What makes a great 20-hour game a bad 40-hour game? And I think it comes down to a couple things. One is the in-game mechanics, and then on the other hand, the story. You can probably pick about any game that's good for 20 hours, and then once you get to about the 40-hour mark, you're like, okay, there's an issue here by looking at one of those 2 things. So I had a couple examples. We'll start off with the mechanics of a game. So Mountain Blade is a game I picked up a couple of years ago, and it's sort of a mixture of action / real-time strategy. It's a great game for the first 20 hours or so, but the problem is a lot of the mechanics aren't there for a late game to make it actually interesting. And so yeah, after about that 20-hour point, you start to feel like you're not progressing past this point, even though there's a lot more to do in game. And so that kind of breaks the game in a way because it makes it a lot less interesting to play after that point, because there are certain aspects of the game that just don't change after that 20-hour point. And so I think that's one example of how mechanically a game can break after a certain point. The other being story drop-off. And for this, I'm going to pull the Mass Effect games. Look at Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 1, a quick playthrough, you can probably get it done in around 20 hours. Hit all the key stops on your way to defeating evil in about that time. There's a lot more you can do in the Mass Effect universe. In the first game, though, all that sort of superfluous stuff doesn't really add up to much. It's not a lot of interaction with other characters. It's not you're not finding out a lot more about the universe. And if it is, it's really mundane information, like running around and scanning planets for resources and things like that. It's not all that interesting. And so if you're trying to play it for get that extended experience, it's not adding much past that first 20 hours. Whereas Mass Effect 2, it kind of reverses that, or it switches up because there's a lot you can do with the characters. And if we're talking about another BioWare game, so there's a lot more in-depth things you can go into with the characters, which is what they're so good at. That makes for a great long experience or short experience, depending on what you want to do.
Yeah, I would actually jump in there and kind of disagree slightly. I mean, in Mass Effect 1, you have kind of the resource gathering and the Mako whole entire situation where you're driving around endlessly in the Mako, and I like the Mako, but there was just a little too much. So then they went the next extreme in the second one, and they took out the Mako entirely. But instead, now you're going.
Goodness.
Well, and I like the Mako to some extent, but then like in the second one, the thing that drove me absolutely insane was I was going planet to planet, scanning endless amounts of planets, trying to find resources so I could build, the expansions to my ship. And it's like some of those you had to have, otherwise you would die in the final mission. Like, just you had to do it. So I think that's kind of a story for, a 20-hour game gone bad, because now instead of going around endlessly in the Mako, they're forcing you to go around endlessly and scan planets. Like, at least in the Mako, I'm controlling it. Like, I'm just going like this, looking on a planet, and then firing a probe. Like, that's horrible to me.
See,
Yeah,
I
I
liked that because it did something. Like, the difference was, like, you gathered the resources in the first game, and it just didn't matter. In the second game, it was like, oh, if I bothered to do this, it has an in-game effect. And, like, I didn't know that because I don't go on the internet and, like, look up the results of your actions beforehand. So I was just running around. I was like, cool, resources. They upgrade my ship. I wonder how that's going to affect the game. And so, I mean, it did something. That's why I thought it was a valuable addition. But I guess it was a little boring. But
And I think if you stack up the amount of time you spent in, say, Mass Effect 2 scanning planets versus the amount of time you spent in the Mako driving across worlds, it's sort of exponentially higher for the first game. Time spent driving around dodging huge worms and blasting monkeys.
and hating yourself.
And
The other thing. Why am I in this stupid Jeep? I'm supposed to be saving the galaxy.
But David, weren't you saying something about like Monster Hunter or something like that earlier?
Oh yeah, so yeah, I just got Monster Hunter for the DS, 3DS, and it's definitely been a disappointment so far. There's just been like the first they run you through a lot of stuff that it almost feels like it's meant to be an in-game tutorial, but it's not really teaching you stuff. You have you unlock the map, so you start out and you walk out of the village and you have Sector 1, and it goes all the way out to like Sector 11 at first, and he'll have you go out to Sector 4 and get something, and come back to the village, and go up to Sector 6 and kill this little dinosaur that doesn't even attack back, and come back to the village. Go out to Sector 8 and look for a mushroom, and come back to the village.
What is this, an MMO?
Yeah, except there's nobody else in the world with you. You're just running little tasks, and I'm like, I'm not having any fun. I don't know who would say, man, I saw a picture of a giant monster and a guy holding a giant axe and thought, I want to collect mushrooms. That's what that game's probably about. Sold. Give me a copy. Like, I want to fight giant monsters. Like, somebody who knows how to build CGI things, build 40 different giant monsters. Give them different kinds of attacks. Give me some weapons that have different strengths versus different types of monsters, and let me go in that world, and when I'm done killing those 40 monsters, the game is over, and make it hard, so that maybe I have to die a few times to figure out the best way to kill these guys. And then you've got a great monster hunting game.
You basically want them to make Dark Souls, is what you're saying.
Like a Dark Souls, Shadow of the Colossus combination.
Yeah, when you go hunt the monsters, like the ones that look really terrible are very terrible, but then the ones that look like a little Yoshi that's gonna like kiss you and hug you actually swallows you and makes you think that it's a treasure.
And you find you have to have like the longest spear possible to fight this tiny rabbit because it'll devour you if you get anywhere close. But like so something like that. Just anything where I'm not hunting mushrooms and going to like out a little bit and a little bit further and a little bit further and coming back
What amazes me, though, is, like, there are some people who like those games. It's like, I want to play spreadsheet data entry, the game.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like. I
Or
don't
like,
get it.
yeah, collect resources.
You're
the
you're
game.
ruining it for the rest of us.
Sounds like something an IRS agent would love to play.
Yeah.
I don't know, just don't name it Monster Hunter, name it The Collector or something like that. But yeah, so the game might get better. I've only played it a little while, but I have played it for maybe an hour or two now, and am just starting to get to where I'm like, well, there's these one little tiny like dinosaurs you fight, but they're just not an issue. Like, again, it kind of makes you feel like your decisions don't matter. Like in a game where you can make decisions, like it lets you make all these conversation decisions, and you find out that none of them affect the storyline. You're like, oh well, who cares? And just get through the story. In the same way, like you feel like I even didn't realize one point I thought the game paused when I was doing something, like when I went to inventory systems, but it doesn't. So I was in inventory systems and being attacked, and I was fine. Like it's not like it should matter if you're not playing the game while you're being attacked. Like you're like in the menus and you're like, oh, what does that item do that I just picked up? And then you realize that the dinosaur has been attacking you. But it's okay because your health bar is like half your screen and they take like a fifth of it, so you've got a minute to deal with the problem. I don't know. Like I mean, it could definitely probably get harder.
It's like a good game concept gone horribly, horribly wrong, and like it's not even a 20-hour game. That's a horrible 2-hour game.
Well, I think the bad parts front loaded, which sometimes I think a good 20-hour game.
Front load the bad parts.
Yeah. Well, I think that does happen. I think that a good example. Oh, I can't remember the guy's name, but he talks about tutorials. I don't know if you've ever seen the video where he talks about how Mega Man has like an awesome tutorial because it's all built within the game. It shows you what you need to do, and you don't realize you're doing it. And he really
talk
hates
about that in the movie Indie Gamer, where they like use the game in the first few levels to teach you how to play the game versus like having a tutorial that teaches you the game is really boring.
Yeah.
Like, you die like 6 times, but you learn, oh, I'm supposed to do this, or oh, I'm supposed to do that, versus like, press A to jump, press B to dive.
Watch out, don't fall in pits, they're dangerous. And you're like, oh, good to know.
Are you sure they're dangerous?
But
Those spikes look okay to me.
Hey, look, I think I could stand on them. But so sometimes, yeah, a bad 40-hour game isn't a good 20 hours that turns into a bad second 20 hours. It's a game that you realize once you get through the crap, it's a fun game, but the tutorial that taught you how to move backwards, left, and forwards using WSAD, I knew that. I didn't need the tutorial to do that. And so some will force you into these tutorials that you're like, man, I've heard good things about this game, but why am I playing this tutorial? And there's not a skip option or something, and it's like, select units by clicking on them. You're like, I could have figured that one out. And so, yeah, the game, just stuff that bogs down a game that you're like, I wish this game had just been 20 hours of all the enjoyable stuff, and not the rest. But yeah, so I think this game is attempting to tutorial before you get into the big stuff. So hopefully it will get better. But the tutorial teaches you how to go between worlds by going to level stage 4 and then back, and stage 6 and back. It's just clunky and unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, I look at games like Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2, and they're games that have great. I don't know. I liked Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 1. I thought the story of Mass Effect 1 was better than Mass Effect 2. I thought that the way that they made characters, your characters could potentially die in Mass Effect 2 was really compelling. But again, it's you're putting in filler. You're putting in a Mako and the mining for resources. Like, I don't think that should be a forced or even an optional. Like, if you're going to put something in a game, it needs to be fun. There shouldn't be components in a game that, and that's my biggest issue with MMOs. You have a questing system that is a primary way of leveling, and so I spend all this time leveling up to get to in-game content that is either mediocre or just okay because they put a lot of effort into building this content out that was just kind of lame and boring. That kind of, I don't know, that's just kind of my thoughts on why a mediocre 20-hour game mediocre 40-hour game. I don't know, I'd rather just have a 20-hour great game than a mediocre 40. Personally.
I think leveling systems versus personal skill leveling systems is a good example of people like Dota, League of Legends, Shadow of the Colossus, Dark Souls are all examples of where you level a lot as a player. You become a lot better as a player to handle a situation versus just being a bigger level. You don't go into League of Legends and you're like, I'm going to win this match. I'm a level 50 and everyone else is level 20. It's like there's some minor leveling systems in it, but a lot of it's how you learn to become better. And people seem to really respond well to that. Dota's doing well, League of Legends doing well. People love Dark Souls. People like Shadow of the Colossus. And they were all games where it wasn't like, man, I can't handle the situation. I'll go grind out 10 levels and buy some more gear. Then it'll be easy peasy. But a lot of games develop that, and I think it's because they're not sure how to balance difficulty. So they say it'll be as difficult as you want it. If you're having trouble fighting a boss, go grind monsters for another 20, 30 minutes. Then it'll be easy. You choose how hard you want the boss to be by how high a level you're going to be when you hit it. And I think we've gotten into situations where like you either were underleveled because you're just kind of rushing along and you hit something and you go, whoa, I'm definitely underleveled by this game, or you kind of had too much fun fighting some stuff and hunting some stuff, and you realize I got about 10 levels over this game, and I stayed that way. I just crushed everything. Like I've played games you kind of got that steamroll advantage, and you just crushed the game because you were about 10 levels higher than it thought you were going to be. And I think it's just maybe a developer difficulty on how to balance how hard something should be, and worrying that they'll push away fans if they don't give the right fans a little easy avenue. Yeah.
I agree. Like, Fable's a perfect example of that. Like, the Fable games, one of the things that made them so... I enjoyed Fable, don't get me wrong. One of the things that made them so terrible was how easy they were. They were boring. It was like, yeah, I became this super powerful hero who did a bunch of interesting things, but who cares? It wasn't hard. Like a 3-year-old, I could have handed a 3-year-old or a dog the controller, and they could have accomplished these things. Like, that's essentially like one of the things that I think can make a longer game boring is if it's not challenging in any way. Like if it's not, like if you're not achieving anything by going through those hours. Like Dark Souls is stupidly long, but the entire time you're playing, like, it's also stupidly hard. So every time you accomplish something, like, you feel like you've somehow grown as a person. Like, you're better than you were before. And, like, with Fable, yeah, I put in, like, 20, 30, 40 hours, but it wasn't hard. It was just pressing a button over and over and over again.
That's kind of how I feel about Diablo. Like,
I agree.
I love the original Diablo, and it was something that was a lot of fun to play when I was younger, and there was cool elements to it, but in the end, it's like I'm not better as a player. I guess somewhat in Diablo 1, but Diablo 2 and Diablo 3 was just kind of like, it got to the point where I had friends that were doing, ball runs and doing it kind of pseudo-professional, like Diablo 2, and it's just like, that. So you're just killing the same monster over and over again to get gear? That sounds pretty boring. And then it's like World of Warcraft. You look at the dungeons and stuff like that, and while there is some experience and learning in that game, it's still kind of just you're grinding through these horribly hard monsters and pressing the same skills over and over and over again. I'm not going to say that about World of Warcraft, because they do actually have a great content system and how they build it. But Chris, what do you think? What is the biggest thing that kind of turns a 20-hour great game into a mediocre 40?
I think most of the time it's story-based. Most of the time, most games don't have enough story to stretch past a 20-hour mark, unless they're just really well done, or have sort of a discovery system like Dark Souls, where you don't really know anything about the world, and you sort of discover it incrementally. But I think that's the number one problem with the majority of games out there. Too much content, not enough story.
So, David, what about you? What's the one big thing?
One big thing. I would say, I would go towards actually filler gameplay, like hacking and slashing through, like, little baddies you don't care about to get to the boss battle or the big fight that you're excited about. You're like, oh, no, we're going to fight something, But anytime you feel like you can't die in the fight, like, you could potentially take a little breather. Like, I like Devil May Cry, and there is a lot of times you're hacking and slashing through little baddies, but there is a little bit of a skill element to where, like, if you do get hooked by one sometimes, then you take a lot of damage you didn't need to take. So it is watching out for the little attack signals they're going to do and stuff like that, and then hacking and slashing away. But you do feel like you couldn't just let your character sit on screen for a few seconds with the bad guys and come back and be fine. Anytime I feel like I can leave my character on screen with bad guys for 5 or 6 seconds, and I know I'm not going to take enough damage to really matter, there's no point to play anymore. Like, I shouldn't be able to leave my character there. But yeah.
I did that with Final Fantasy a lot. Final Fantasy 7, because there was no save. Like, if you weren't at a save point, you just you just stopped moving and you left it on until you got back. But Derek, what do you think, man?
Mine's kind of similar to Chris's, except like I'd modify it slightly. Like anytime, like your game has to have some sort of goal as a game. Like Dark Souls doesn't have a lot of story. But, I mean, the goal of the game is to present you with these interesting environments and situations that challenge you, and you're forced to try to overcome them. There is a certain amount of story. So that's kind of the goal of Dark Souls. Other games, I mean, they're trying to tell a story. And anytime that you have content that doesn't contribute to those goals meaningfully, that I think is what turns games into bad games. Like, if you have a bunch of content in a role-playing game that's not driving the story forward and making things happen, I'm wasting my time. And if you have like a challenge, like a game that's like an action-adventure game, and you're not challenging me and giving me problems to solve and difficult things to overcome, you're wasting my time. So that's kind of my opinion. If your content isn't you can smell the difference. Like if they've stuck this in there just because they needed stuff to pad out the game, or if it's trying to meaningfully contribute towards the main goal, like you can tell. It's easy.
Okay,
so that's my opinion.
One sentence as a message to game developers who make mediocre 40-hour games, and we'll be done for this topic. Derek, go.
I think that if you're sitting there after you've done your initial development and you're like, we don't have enough content, well, don't like. Number one, I would rather have a short, good game than a long, boring game. Like, don't water down your game with crappy content. And number two, if you want to have a longer game, you need to generate meaningful content. Like, otherwise, you're not going to have a good game. So take the time and take the effort in development to build that good content.
David.
Yeah, I would say if you can, do a Kickstarter so you have control over your product, and then just make it good, and don't worry about the standards that either they feel or advertisers feel or whoever feels like we need a game to be this long game. I'd rather just have it be a good game. If that means it's a 15 or 20-hour game, if it's a 15 or 20-hour amazing game, then I'll pay money for it, and I'll play it and be happy that I did. I've played a handful of games that are super short, but then you replay them. If they're just good, condensed quality content, then you might play it a second time just because you're like, oh, that was so good. And then you've got a 40-hour game because you played it twice. You know, and there's Shadow of the Colossus I've played multiple times. And so, yeah, just focus on making it good and not like, will we be disappointed if there's not enough quantity to it.
All right, Chris, close us out.
One sentence, find out a story that you want to tell or an experience that you want to share with your audience, and then just tell it. Don't overdo it. That's what expansions are for, and sequels, and that's what a series is for. Just don't overwrite it. Don't overmake it.
Make good games.
Whoa, we're here to help with advice from all of our experience of playing them.
Yeah.
No, please, hire us.
No, please.
We offer a very minimal consulting fee that can help.
$5 million.
That's hardly anything.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next week. All right. Later.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, and feel free to take a look at our website, www.ultimategamedb.com, and subscribe to our channel. We would love to see you there.
Definitely also check us out on Facebook and Twitter. If you like us or follow us, you'll be able to see when we're posting new shows and also a lot of articles. The Ultimate Game Database posts a lot of stuff on what games are coming out that week, how the consoles are doing on the console wars, a lot of fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so subscribe, like us,
tweet us, and we will see you next week. Bye!